What would you do if the person lying beside you every night had stopped seeing you years ago, not out of cruelty, not betrayal, just silence? Eleanor Walsh had a beautiful home, a successful husband, and everything that looked like love from the outside. But inside their marriage, the rooms had grown cold. For 2 years, they hadn't touched. For longer, they hadn't really spoken. They moved like roommates in a museum, elegant, quiet, and invisible to one another. Then one evening, Eleanor set down her fork, looked across the table, and said softly, "I think I'm ready to leave. But what if your partner doesn't fight you? What if the pain isn't in the shouting, but in the absence of any sound at all? Now ask yourself, if you were Eleanor, would you stay and slowly disappear, or walk away and risk never being seen again?" This is not a story about divorce. It's a story about distance and the courage it takes to cross it. If this story echoes something in your heart, if you've ever felt alone beside someone who promised to stay, please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Because the most powerful love stories don't always begin with fireworks. Sometimes they begin with a whisper, "I miss us." Now, let's begin. The house stood in quiet perfection on the edge of a forest in Vermont. Snow clung softly to the branches of the maple trees outside the windows, and the fireplace in the great room crackled with low, dignified restraint. Everything was in its place: the cream-colored rug, the polished hardwood floors, the expensive paintings Eleanor had never liked, but had agreed to hang because Richard said they added stature. She sat alone at the dining table, pushing roasted vegetables around her plate. Across from her, the chair remained empty, just like it had for most of the past 2 years. The roast chicken had grown cold. She checked the clock, 7:46 p.m. He was late, again. Not that it surprised her, not that anything surprised her anymore. Richard had sent a text earlier, short and efficient. "Running late. Meeting with Singapore team. Eat without me." Eleanor didn't reply. There didn't seem to be a point. She lifted her wine glass to her lips, took a slow sip, and listened to the only sound in the house, the hum of the refrigerator and the wind howling faintly against the windows. There was something deeply haunting about a house so well kept, so warm, so beautiful, and yet utterly, impossibly empty. People envied her life. That much she knew. They envied the house, the parties, the trips, the way Richard carried himself in photos like he'd been born knowing how to conquer a boardroom. And her, the quiet, graceful wife who always wore pearls, always sent thank you cards, always smiled politely. But no one envied the silence. No one saw the nights when Richard disappeared into his home office and didn't return until after she was asleep. No one asked why they always arrived separately to events. No one dared mention that Richard never touched her anymore, not even a brush of fingers, not a kiss on the cheek. She hadn't been touched in over 700 days. The first year, she had made excuses. Work was stressful, the company was expanding, time zones made connection hard, but the second year had unraveled her. It wasn't just the lack of physical intimacy, though, that stung deeply. It was the absence of being seen, of being heard. Richard had perfected the art of being present without truly being there, of speaking without saying anything real. Their conversations had become transactions, dry logistics, calendar reminders, updates about the gardener or her charity events. No heart, no heat, no home. And the worst part, she wasn't even angry anymore. Anger had come and gone in year 1. Now, she was just tired. Eleanor rose from the table and carried her untouched plate to the sink. She scraped the food into the garbage disposal, rinsed the dish, dried it carefully, and returned it to the cabinet. Every motion calm, every gesture elegant, the kind of poise one builds when they've run out of ways to scream. She stood at the large kitchen window for a long time, watching the trees sway in the wind, their branches like aching arms stretching towards something unseen. Then, she whispered softly to herself, "I'm still here, but I don't know why." Her own voice startled her. She hadn't spoken aloud all evening, not once. She walked to the living room and lit a single candle. The flame flickered uncertainly before settling into a quiet glow. She sat in the armchair near the fire, the one she always sat in, the one Richard never touched. She tried to remember the last time they had laughed together, the last time he had held her hand, the last time he had looked at her with that softness that used to melt her. But the memories were foggy now, distant, almost like they belonged to someone else. In a drawer upstairs, there was a photograph of them from 6 years ago. They were on a sailboat off the coast of Maine, wind in their hair, eyes squinting against the sun. He was holding her waist. She was laughing, her head tilted back. That woman felt like a stranger now. Eleanor stood and turned off the light. She climbed the stairs, each step echoing in the quiet. In the master bedroom, she changed into her nightgown, brushed her hair, and placed her wedding ring on the bedside table. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in months. She simply climbed into bed, turned off the lamp, and lay in the dark, listening for footsteps that would never come. Tomorrow, she thought, she would say something, or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe silence had become their only shared language. The morning came soft and silver. Light slipped through the linen curtains in quiet waves, touching the edges of the bed like an apology. Eleanor opened her eyes before the alarm clock could pretend it mattered. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, the same one she had traced with tired eyes for 2 years. Richard's side of the bed remained untouched, sheets crisp, pillow undented. He had come home sometime after midnight, like always. She'd heard his briefcase on the entry table, the slow creak of the stairs, the soft shut of his office door. He never came into the bedroom anymore, unless she wasn't in it. Eleanor sat up and pulled her robe tight around her. She didn't rush. She never rushed. Her movements were measured, graceful, the kind of stillness that wasn't passive, but deliberate. Downstairs, she brewed coffee, the kitchen filled with the rich scent. And for a moment, it reminded her of mornings long ago when Richard would come up behind her, slide his arms around her waist, press his lips to her neck. She used to close her eyes and lean into him, memorizing the shape of that quiet joy. But that version of Richard had vanished. Now. She poured her coffee in silence, took it out to the garden, and sat on the stone bench she had installed herself last spring. It overlooked the row of hydrangeas she loved, but he never noticed. From here, the house looked almost like a painting, idyllic, stately, a life anyone would covet. But Eleanor knew the truth. Beauty doesn't make a prison less real. It only makes the silence echo louder. She sipped slowly, letting the air sting her face. Her fingers curled around the warm mug like it was the only thing she had left to hold. People thought of her as the ideal woman, composed, generous, elegant in that old-world way that made others feel inadequate without understanding why. She volunteered at the town library, donated to animal shelters, hosted fundraisers with perfect menus and candlelight. But what they didn't see was the cost of that perfection. Behind the charity dinners and monogram stationery lived a woman who had grown used to being invisible, even in her own life. She wasn't passive, not weak, not fragile. Eleanor had survived a father who left, a mother who withered, a childhood of smiling politely at sharp edges. She knew how to endure. But now, she questioned whether enduring was the same as living. She hadn't told anyone, not even Marjorie, her oldest friend who now lived 3 states away. The shame of failure was heavy, even when it wasn't yours, especially when people looked at your life and said, "You're so lucky, lucky, lucky to be ignored, to sleep alone beside a man she once couldn't get enough of, to walk through her days like a ghost inside a gallery of curated moments." She took another sip of coffee and felt the bitterness cling to the back of her tongue. Richard wasn't cruel. He didn't yell or cheat or belittle. He didn't do anything, really. And that, she realized, was its own kind of cruelty. Love didn't die in grand explosions. It withered in silence. It unraveled in small, daily absences, in unsaid words, unfelt touches, unasked questions. She had asked herself over and over, is it me? Had she grown too quiet, too steady? Had she stopped being exciting, unpredictable, beautiful? She looked at her reflection in the garden window. Her face had lines now, not deep ones, but enough to mark the years. Her hair was still thick, brushed into its usual neat style, She wore minimal makeup, just enough to look finished. She was still beautiful, but in the kind of way people don't notice until you've walked away. A sparrow fluttered onto the stone path. Eleanor watched it hop, tiny and aimless, pecking at invisible crumbs. Then, just as quickly, it flew away. She envied it. She wondered what it would feel like to fly without asking permission. She thought of the envelope upstairs in her desk drawer. The lawyer's card was tucked inside. A woman named Catherine Briggs, recommended by a woman at the art gallery. Eleanor hadn't called yet, but she kept the card close, just in case she woke up one morning and could no longer pretend. Just in case, pretending was the thing that finally broke her. The evening air was heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves could feel what was coming. Eleanor stood in front of the full-length mirror in the hallway, brushing non-existent lint from the sleeve of her navy cashmere sweater. The house was silent again, not the peaceful kind, the kind that pulsed with things unsaid. Downstairs, the front door clicked open. She listened. Richard's shoes struck the marble floor in their usual precise rhythm. The man never stumbled, never fumbled. He moved like a man trained in efficiency, as though emotion were an enemy of progress. Keys on the tray, jacket folded, briefcase on the console. He didn't call out to her. He never did. Eleanor walked down the stairs slowly, her hands resting lightly on the polished railing. He was in the kitchen now, pouring himself a glass of scotch, the expensive kind he reserved for deals worth celebrating. She stood in the doorway, watching his back. The clock on the microwave read 9:42 p.m. Long meeting, she asked, her voice calm, too calm. Richard turned slightly, startled, but masking it well. Singapore's budget ran over. We were trying to correct projections. Eleanor nodded once. Dinner was 3 hours ago. I told you not to wait. I didn't. She stepped into the kitchen, barefoot on the cold stone floor. Her eyes didn't leave his. I have something I need to say. He took a slow sip of scotch, then set the glass down carefully. He looked tired. But more than that, he looked elsewhere. Always elsewhere. I'm not doing this tonight, he said, rubbing his temple. Yes, Richard, you are. He met her gaze now, and for a flicker of a second, something passed between them, an old recognition, a sharpness. I called a divorce attorney. The words dropped like wet cloth onto stone. Heavy, final, real. Richard blinked, then frowned. Not angry, not surprised, just blank. You're serious? Eleanor folded her arms across her chest, not defensively, but to hold herself steady. I've been serious for a long time. This is just the first time I've said it aloud. Richard stepped back, leaning against the counter, his eyes flicking to the window, then back to her. I didn't cheat on you. I know. I don't drink too much. I don't yell. I provide. I've given you everything. No, Eleanor replied, her voice low and clear. You gave me things. Not everything. Not what I needed. He said nothing. She stepped forward, her voice rising only slightly. You gave me square footage and credit cards and country club invitations. But you haven't touched me in 2 years. Richard, 2 years. I've been under pressure. No. She cut in, the first sharpness in her tone. No more excuses. This isn't about quarterly goals or market fluctuations. This is about the fact that you moved out of our bedroom without saying a word and expected me to pretend that was normal. He looked down. Tell me something, she said. Softer now. When did I become furniture to you? A painting on the wall, something you own but no longer see? He didn't answer. She let the silence breathe, then filled it with truth. I still love you, or at least, I think I do. But I can't love a ghost. Richard. And I won't spend another year loving someone who's already left. Finally, he spoke, voice strained. So what now? You pack up and vanish. Just like that. No, Eleanor said. I'm telling you. So you have a chance to choose. He narrowed his eyes. Choose what, choose to fight, or choose to let me go. But either way, I'm not standing still anymore. He crossed his arms. This is dramatic. No, she said. "This is the most undramatic thing I've ever done. This is survival." The silence returned, longer now. Richard walked to the sink, turned on the tap, then turned it off without filling the glass. "I need time. You've had 2 years. He looked at her, finally, fully, and in that look, she saw something flicker fear, maybe, or the faintest trace of a man she used to know. But it wasn't enough. Eleanor turned, walking toward the hallway. He called after her, "Eleanor." She stopped, her back to him. "Don't walk away," he said. She looked over her shoulder. "I'm not walking away. I'm finally walking towards something." And then she left the kitchen. This time, he didn't follow. The next morning arrived with a quiet ache. Eleanor sat at the small breakfast table by the window, a linen napkin folded neatly in her lap, though she wasn't eating. Outside, snow flurried like tiny dancers on an invisible stage, landing softly on the deck railing. Inside, the silence stretched its limbs again, only this time, it was no longer welcome. She'd said the words now. There was no going back. And yet, part of her did. Not to him, not to last night's stone-faced reaction, but to the before, to the man she once knew, to the fire. It had started on a summer night in Boston, 14 years ago. She had been standing in line at a gallery opening, drenched in August humidity, holding a folded paper fan to her neck when he first spoke to her. "You know that painting you're about to see?" His voice was low, smooth, with just the right edge of mischief. "It's overrated." Eleanor turned, eyebrow raised. "Really? You crash gallery lines just to ruin strangers' anticipation?" He smiled, only when the stranger looks like she actually sees art. They ended up skipping the exhibit altogether and wandering the city instead. 2 hours later, they were eating tiramisu from paper cups on a park bench, while trading stories about the worst dates they'd ever been on. He made her laugh, the real kind, from the belly, from the soul. He was passionate back then, about design, architecture, photography. He used to carry a little leather notebook and write things down, quotes, building facades he liked, people's habits in cafes. He once told her he was afraid of being just successful without being alive. That version of Richard, he smelled like cedar and citrus, played piano in secret, and kissed her like he might never get the chance again. They took road trips up the coast in his old silver Volvo, ate lobster rolls at gas stations, made love in motels with bad wallpaper and even worse lighting. But it never mattered. They were incandescent, raw, in love. When he proposed, it wasn't at a party or in front of an audience. It was in their tiny kitchen in Cambridge, while she stood barefoot with flour on her hands. He slid a ring onto her finger without a word, just a look wide, hopeful, vulnerable. She had said yes before he even asked. Marriage didn't scare her, not then, because they were fire, uncontrolled, uncontained, but bright. She remembered how he used to trace the line of her collarbone with his fingers, murmuring things like, "You're not beautiful because of the way you look. You're beautiful because of the way you listen." She remembered rainy Sundays spent wrapped in one blanket, reading to each other from novels they'd pulled randomly off bookstore shelves. She remembered that Richard once built her a bookshelf in secret because she'd complained that her paperbacks were stacked in messy towers on the floor. He stayed up all night assembling it while she slept. He never told her. She just woke up to it one morning, a surprise, standing like a quiet monument to his care. So what happened? Where did that man go? Was he still buried somewhere under the 1,000 meetings and muted affections, or had he simply disappeared? Eleanor closed her eyes and rested her forehead on her hand. Her mind churned with images, so many warm moments, like old film reels spinning in the dark. She had loved him, and he had loved her. That was the part that hurt the most. They hadn't fallen out of love in some grand betrayal. They had simply drifted, one quiet hour at a time. She opened her eyes and looked around the kitchen. It was sleek now, perfect. Stainless steel appliances, white quartz countertops, no fingerprints, no mess, no memories. And for the first time, she realized something with clarity. They had traded passion for peace, and then peace for silence, and then silence for nothing. Eleanor stood and poured her untouched tea down the sink. The sound of it running felt louder than it should have. She needed to remember that version of them, not to mourn, but to measure, to see the distance between who they were and who they'd become. Because if she was going to walk away, she needed to know what exactly she was leaving behind. It started with the bookshelf, the one Richard had built for her years ago, back when they lived in Cambridge. She hadn't thought about it in a long time, but something from yesterday's memories nudged her back toward it. The old bookshelf was now tucked away in the guest room, filled mostly with books she never reread. She hadn't been in that room in months, maybe longer. That afternoon, while the wind swirled snow across the windows, Eleanor opened the door and stepped into the past. The room smelled faintly of cedar and aged paper. She trailed her fingers along the book's spines, pausing now and then at titles she used to love: Bel Canto, Gilead, The English Patient. On the bottom shelf, one of the books wobbled slightly when she touched it. She pulled it out, a worn edition of The Art of Stillness by Pico Ear. Behind it, pushed against the back wall of the shelf, was a small wooden box, smooth, dark, hand-carved. She had never seen it before. Her heart hesitated. She sat down on the edge of the bed and lifted the lid. Inside were letters folded neatly, each one sealed in its envelope. They all had her name on the front, her full name, written in Richard's handwriting, Eleanor Grace Walsh. Some were dated, some weren't. Her fingers trembled. She opened the one on top. October 12th, year 2 of our marriage. You looked at me today while you were watering the basil, and I forgot how to breathe. You still take my breath away, even after I've pushed you so far away. I don't know how to tell you I'm scared. Scared of needing you so much. Scared of what I might do if I let you too close. My father used to say that love makes you soft, weak. I think I've been trying not to become soft ever since. I hate him for that, but I don't know how to be different. Eleanor pressed her hand against her chest, as if to steady her ribs. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anything. She opened another. December 23rd. I heard you crying in the shower this morning. I stood outside the door, hand raised to knock, but I didn't. I froze, like I always do. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Elle, you deserve better, but I don't know how to be better. I keep thinking I'll fix it tomorrow. Then tomorrow comes, and I retreat. Again. Her vision blurred. She hadn't even known he noticed. For 2 years, she had lived in silence, thinking she was unloved. But the truth, the real truth, was so much more complicated, so much more human. It wasn't that he didn't love her. It was that he didn't know how to survive the intensity of his own love. She read 5 more, then 6. Each one filled with that same aching tenderness. Love soaked in fear, admiration tangled in guilt. A man simultaneously reaching for her and pulling away. In one of the letters, he wrote, "Sometimes I lie awake and wonder what my life would be like if I'd been raised in a home where love wasn't a weapon, where it wasn't given and withdrawn like punishment. You love without conditions, Eleanor, and that terrifies me, because I don't think I've ever believed I'm worthy of that kind of love." She closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. This wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was explanation, and that, somehow, made a difference. He hadn't told her any of this, hadn't shared these words when she needed them, hadn't stopped her the night she said divorce, but he had felt deeply, desperately, and he had kept these letters, even if he never meant her to find them, or maybe a part of him had. She gathered them gently and placed them back in the box, her movements reverent, like she was handling something sacred. Then she sat there, in that quiet room, for a long time. She didn't know what this meant yet. She only knew that the story she'd been telling herself that he didn't care, that he was indifferent, wasn't the whole story. There was love there, buried, unspoken, afraid, but real. And now, she had to decide, was knowing that enough to try again? She didn't pack much. 2 suitcases, one for clothes, one for books and sketch pads. There was no dramatic sweeping of drawers, no shredding of photographs, no yelling, no doors slammed, just quiet movement. It was mid-morning when she left. The snow had melted a little, and Vermont was trading its white for gray. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment, coat zipped, gloves in hand, and looked back at the home she had once thought she'd grow old in. The fireplace was still burning. The air still held the scent of cedar and something citrus Richard's cologne, faint and lingering. He wasn't there. He had flown to New York for a 2-day board meeting. She hadn't told him she was leaving. Not yet. She left a note, not long, not cruel. Richard, I need space to breathe. Not to punish you, not to hurt you, but because I can't hear my own voice inside these walls anymore. I hope you understand that I am not closing the door. I am opening a window. For both of us. Eleanor. She folded it once, placed it on the kitchen counter, and walked out into the crisp air. Her car started on the first try. It felt strange, driving away from something that wasn't broken in the usual ways. There were no bruises, no betrayals, just too much distance and not enough truth. She called Marjorie from the road. Her friend answered on the second ring. Eleanor. You okay? I'm coming to stay for a while. If that's all right. Marjorie didn't hesitate. I'll make the bed and open a bottle of Pinot. By the time she pulled into Marjorie's driveway 5 hours later, Eleanor felt equal parts weightless and hollow. The house was smaller, warmer, lived in, smelled like rosemary and fabric softener. A gold lab barked from the back porch, and Marjorie opened the door in fuzzy socks and a fleece vest. Get in here, woman, she said, pulling her into a hug. Eleanor hadn't realized how much she needed that hug until it landed. Over dinner chicken soup and crusty bread, Marjorie didn't press for details. She never did. She just listened. And that night, lying in a guest bed that creaked with every shift, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and let herself feel, really feel, the grief, the fatigue, the quiet guilt of walking away, but also the peace. She hadn't felt that in years. Not because she didn't love Richard. She did. But she needed to remember how to love herself too. For too long, she had shrunk to fit the silence, had become the shadow of the woman she used to be gracious. Yes, but absent from her own spirit. Now, in this old house with mismatched lamps and a dog snoring in the hall, Eleanor felt more present than she had in a very long time. She still didn't know what came next. She didn't know if the letters meant change. She didn't know if Richard would reach for her. But she knew this. Sometimes, loving someone means stepping far enough away that they have to choose whether to follow. He didn't notice she was gone at first. Not really. He came home from New York late Friday evening. The board meetings had run long, and the weather delayed his flight. He was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones and makes everything blur. He stepped into the house, expecting the same stillness he always returned to. But something was different. The lights were off. The kitchen was clean, too clean. He set his suitcase down and loosened his tie. The fireplace hadn't been lit. The usual smell of Eleanor's herbal tea wasn't in the air. No candle had been burned, no coat draped over the stair rail. Just silence. The kind that wasn't routine. The kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He found the note on the counter. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. When he read her handwriting, neat, familiar, steady, he felt something shift inside him. Not a crack. Not yet. But a tremor. He read it again. Slowly this time. I am not closing the door. I am opening a window. For both of us. Richard sat at the kitchen table and lowered his head into his hands. For the first time in months, maybe years, he truly realized what he had done. Or rather, what he had not done. He hadn't held her, hadn't heard her, hadn't tried. He told himself he was doing the best he could. He told himself that Eleanor was strong, patient, understanding, that she would stay because she always did, because she knew him better than anyone. But maybe that was the very reason she left. She had known him deeply, and she had finally understood he wasn't there. He had been living like a man underwater, holding his breath through marriage, numbing his days with work and obligations, retreating into his office like a bunker. His silence hadn't been passive. It had been armor, and now he was alone inside it. He walked through the house that night like a stranger touching the back of chairs. the edge of picture frames, the curve of the railing she used to polish every week. He found her favorite sweater draped over the reading chair. He picked it up, held it to his face, and breathed. There was no one left to keep him from himself. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in their bed, his bed now staring at the ceiling, his chest tight. It wasn't just that she was gone. It was that he could no longer pretend she would always stay. He rose before dawn and wandered into his office, the one place he always felt in control. But even here, her absence lingered in the empty teacup she'd left last month, the post-it note she had written with a grocery reminder, eggs, spinach, remember to breathe. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and then closed it again. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out one of his journals. He flipped to a blank page and stared at it. Then, slowly, he began to write. I didn't know how to say any of it when you were here, but maybe now, without you, I'll find the courage to learn. He kept writing, for hours, not letters this time, just truth, memories, regrets, questions. He wasn't sure what he was becoming, only that the version of himself who had watched his wife slip away in silence was not the man he wanted to remain. The first call came 4 days after she left. Eleanor didn't answer. She saw his name flash on the screen while she was folding laundry in Marjorie's sunroom. She stared at it until the screen dimmed, her hands still clutching a soft cotton sweater. He didn't leave a message. The second call came 2 days later. This time, she let it ring all the way through, then played the voicemail when she was alone. Hey, it's me. I'm not sure what to say. I keep rewriting this in my head and it all sounds stupid. But I hope you're okay. That's all. I hope you're okay. It wasn't much, but it was something. She sat with it, not rushing to respond, not rushing to forgive, just letting it exist. Marjorie, wise as ever, didn't pry. She handed Eleanor a cup of tea that evening and said, "You'll know when it's time. For anything. Or nothing." On the 7th day, Eleanor called back. He picked up on the first ring. Eleanor. He breathed, like her name was the first full inhale he'd taken in weeks. She didn't speak right away. The silence hung, but it wasn't the heavy, hopeless silence that used to fill their home. This one was suspended, waiting. I got your message, she said softly. I didn't know if I should call. He replied, I didn't want to intrude. You're not intruding, she said, but I'm not ready to come back. I know. Another pause. Then he said something she hadn't expected. I'm seeing someone. She blinked. What a therapist. He added quickly, not God, not like that. A real therapist. Her name's Dana. She's making me look at things I haven't wanted to look at. Eleanor sat down. I found the letters, she said after a moment. There was a long exhale on the other end. I wondered if you would, he said. I used to think writing them was enough, that the feeling was real, even if the words never reached you. But now I know. Silence isn't love, it's fear. She didn't reply. I'm sorry, he said. For every time I stood 2 feet away from you and made you feel 100 miles alone, that cracked something. Not completely, but enough. I didn't leave to punish you. Richard, she said gently. I left to breathe. I know. I'm still breathing. That's good, he said, voice breaking just slightly. I hope one day you'll let me sit next to you while you do. The vulnerability in his words startled her not because he said them, but because he meant them. It wasn't polished. It wasn't a plea. It was a man, stripped of performance, showing his wound. I don't know what happens next, she said. Me neither, he replied. But I'd like to find out, even if it's just a conversation at a time. She nodded, forgetting he couldn't see her. Okay, she whispered. They didn't stay on the phone long. 23 minutes, long enough to stretch across the space between them, but not long enough to solve anything. That wasn't the point. The point was, something had shifted. This time, silence wasn't the absence of love. It was the breath between two people learning how to speak again, They chose the park. Not a restaurant, not a living room, not the house where their ghost still lived. Just a quiet park in Northampton, halfway between where she was and where he remained. It was early spring, the kind of day where the sun was warm enough to coax open the first green shoots, but the wind still carried the sharpness of winter's memory. Eleanor arrived early. She always did. She wore a light scarf and soft gray coat. Her hair, pulled back in a low bun, caught the breeze. The bench beneath the old willow stood just as she remembered it. They had sat there once, 9 years ago, sharing a sandwich and arguing over whether Georgia O'Keeffe's desert landscapes were more about longing or defiance. That had been one of their better days. She brushed off the bench before sitting. The branches above swayed gently, trailing just low enough to create a kind of hush around her, as if nature itself wanted to make space for what was coming. Richard arrived 3 minutes late. He approached slowly, his coat buttoned too high, like he'd dressed in a rush. When he saw her, he stopped for a moment. Then he smiled. Not the professional one, not the tight-lipped public smile he used at galas and client meetings. A real one, tentative, hopeful. She nodded at the open half of the bench. He sat, leaving space between them. Not cold space, respectful space. They sat in silence for a minute, 2. The wind rustled. Children laughed faintly in the distance. Finally, he spoke. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't either," she replied. Another pause. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He handed it to her. She hesitated, then unfolded it. It was a journal entry from the day after she left. March 18th. There's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I used to think I preferred the former. Now, I understand I never left the latter behind. I miss the way she looks at the world, the way she notices the small things: a chipped teacup, a child's shoelace, the way the sky turns silver before it rains. I miss her attention, her silence, even that part of her that pulls away when she's thinking. I never realized silence could be intimate until Eleanor folded the page carefully and set it on her lap. "You're learning how to say what you feel," she said. "I'm trying. I see that." He nodded, glancing down at his hands. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "And not through letters this time." She turned slightly, waiting. He took a breath. "My father used to disappear," he said. "Sometimes for days, sometimes just in the room. My mother used to pretend everything was fine. She would smile through dinners, explain away his silences. I learned early that being invisible was safer." He paused. "I swore I'd never be like him. And yet I built the same silence around you. I thought I was protecting you from my darkness, but I was really protecting myself from being seen." His voice trembled. "I was afraid that if you really saw me, all of me, you'd leave." She looked at him then, long and slow. "I didn't leave because I saw you," she said. "I left because you wouldn't let me be seen." The words landed heavy, but true. He nodded, swallowing hard. "I know, and I'm sorry. For every moment I made you feel like loving me was a burden." They sat quietly again. Then she reached for his hand, not fully, just enough to let her fingers brush the edge of his. He looked at her, eyes damp, but not broken. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We keep talking," she said. "We sit on benches. We listen. We tell the truth, even when it's hard. Can we start again?" She exhaled, steady and slow. "Maybe not from the beginning," she said, "but from here, from this bench, from this breath." He smiled again, softer this time. Not everything was healed, but something had begun. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic return to the house, no suitcase dropped at the door, no passionate embrace framed in falling leaves. Instead, there were morning walks. They met twice a week at the trail near the river. No expectations, no scripts, just steps. Eleanor would bring a thermos of coffee. Richard brought apples, sliced and shared silently on a wooden bench. They talked about unimportant things, the strange weather patterns, the old woman who fed squirrels by the duck pond, the book Eleanor had just finished reading. But slowly, like the thawing of early spring ground, deeper words began to surface. She told him about the loneliness, the kind that settled in her body like a second skin. He told her about the panic attacks, the ones he'd hidden by locking himself in the bathroom, running the faucet to mask his shaking. She confessed that for months she had considered leaving without a word, that the only reason she hadn't was because she didn't want her last act in their story to be silence. He confessed that he had once stood outside her studio door, hand raised to knock, then walked away. 10 times. They were awkward together, at first. Their words were like unfamiliar shoes, stiff, uncomfortable, prone to pinching in all the wrong places. But they kept walking. And then, one Saturday afternoon, she agreed to return to the house, not to move back, but to visit. It had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Her favorite chair was in a different corner, angled toward the window now. The kitchen was cleaner. The photographs on the wall had shifted. One of them, a candid shot from a trip to Maine, had been moved to the hallway, framed in wood. Richard greeted her at the door with a nervous smile. "I didn't know what to cook," he admitted. They ended up ordering Thai food. She sat on the edge of the couch while he brought out mismatched plates and cloth napkins. When he handed her a fork, his hand lingered a second too long. Their eyes met. She didn't pull away. That night, they talked for 3 hours. No big breakthroughs, just honest conversation about their families, about the way the world felt too fast, about the weight of expectation. Before she left, he walked her to her car. He didn't ask her to stay. She didn't offer, but she paused before opening the door. "I'm afraid," he admitted softly, "of what that'll mess it up, that you'll come close and I'll shut down again." She looked at him, her eyes steady. "Then we make a rule," she said. "No shutting down. If you can't speak, you write. If you can't write, you sit beside me, but no retreating." He nodded. "I can do that." She believed him, not because he promised, but because, for the first time, he didn't try to be perfect. He just tried to be there, and that more than gestures or gifts was what she had always needed. Not grand declarations, just presence. Consistent, vulnerable, real. It was a Tuesday when the call came. Richard was in his office, writing not emails or presentations, but something personal, a habit now. One of the many things therapy had gently nudged open. He still wasn't fluent in emotion, but he was learning the language. The phone buzzed twice, unknown number. He let it ring. Then, a voicemail. He listened. Once, then again. When he finally stood, he was pale. Eleanor arrived at the house later that evening. They had plans to cook together. When she walked in and saw his face, she knew something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, setting her bag down. Richard leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed tightly. His voice was flat, but his eyes gave him away. "My father's in the hospital. Heart failure." Eleanor stood still, her breath catching. In all the years they'd been married, Richard had barely spoken about the man. When he did, it was like naming a storm long past with reverence and fear. She stepped closer. "Do you want to see him?" "I don't know." The truth was, Richard hadn't seen his father in over 12 years. Not since the last Thanksgiving, when a slammed door and one bitter sentence, "You'll never be anything but weak," had ended things for good. They sat down at the kitchen table. Eleanor waited. He finally looked up. "I always thought cutting him off made me free, but I think maybe I just became him in a different shape." She reached across the table and laid her hand on his. "You're not him, Richard." He stared at her hand, then turned it over gently in his own. "I want to go," he said, "but I can't go alone." Eleanor's answer was simple. "Then I'm coming with you." The hospital room was dim, the machines beeping in slow, metronomic rhythm. Richard's father, Gerald Walsh, lay still, a shell of the man Richard remembered, smaller, grayer, quieter. He opened his eyes as they entered. Richard froze in the doorway. Gerald's eyes flicked to his son, then back to the ceiling. "So you finally came?" It wasn't angry, just stated. Richard walked in slowly, Eleanor, just behind. There were no flowers, no cards. No one else had visited. Gerald looked at Eleanor. "You're the wife." "Yes," she said softly. "I'm Eleanor. You're not what I expected." Eleanor smiled, only slightly. People rarely are. The room grew heavy again. "Finally," Gerald said. "You were always soft." Richard flinched, but didn't retreat. "I was," he said, "still am." "You think that's something to be proud of?" Richard stepped closer. "I used to think it made me weak. I built walls, stayed quiet, shut people out just like you taught me, and it nearly cost me my marriage." Gerald looked away. "I thought silence meant strength." Richard continued, "But it only left me alone. I don't want to end like that." He looked at his father, really looked at the fragility of the man who had once towered over him with judgment and fear. "I came to tell you that I forgive you," Richard said, "not because you asked, but because I need to." Gerald's jaw clenched. Eleanor reached out and gently touched Richard's arm. "You'll never understand what you did to me," Richard added, "but I understand now that healing isn't about making you feel guilty. It's about not letting your silence define mine." There was nothing grand in the moment that followed. No cinematic apology. No tearful embrace. Gerald blinked, once, then closed his eyes. Whether from exhaustion or surrender, Richard would never know. But as they walked out of the room, something in Richard's shoulders changed. The years of carrying someone else's pain had begun to lift. In the elevator, Eleanor took his hand. He squeezed it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what? For seeing me. And still standing here." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was never trying to fix you," she whispered. "I just wanted to meet you, without the armor." He turned his head and kissed her hair. It was the smallest gesture, but it was everything. It was late May when Eleanor came back to the house, not as a guest, not just for dinner, but with her suitcases. She parked in the same driveway she had left 3 months earlier, only now. The lilacs were in bloom along the edge of the property. Their scent hung in the air, soft, nostalgic, forgiving. Richard stood at the front door, not waiting inside, but outside, on the porch. She stepped out of the car, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. There was no rush, no dramatic reunion, no tearful apologies, just a quiet knowing. He walked down the steps, took her bag from her hand, and said, "Welcome home." They didn't call it a fresh start. There were too many memories in the walls for that. Instead, they agreed to a new rhythm not built on performance, but participation. They cooked together on Sundays, walked after dinner on Wednesdays, started keeping a shared journal in the kitchen, a place to write the things that were hard to say out loud. They fought sometimes, gently, respectfully, and then they returned to each other, not with shame, but with softness. One night, Eleanor surprised him with a dinner in the backyard, candles, music, her famous lemon rosemary chicken. Nothing fancy, just them. After dessert, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" She smiled, a new vow. He unfolded it and read aloud, "I don't promise to be perfect. I don't promise that I won't get tired, or scared, or quiet again. But I promise to tell the truth when I can, to ask for space without building walls, to show up, not just in body, but in heart, and to never let silence become a substitute for presence." When he finished, she looked at him. "Do you have one?" she asked. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small card. "You know me too well," he said, smiling sheepishly. He cleared his throat and read, "I promise to speak, even when my voice shakes. To look you in the eye when things feel hard. To stay not out of habit, but out of choice. To let you see me, even when I'm afraid. And to remember, every day, that love isn't something we fall into. It's something we build side by side." She blinked slowly, tears filling her eyes but not falling. "Side by side," she whispered. They didn't exchange rings, didn't sign papers, didn't post anything online. Instead, they stood in their own backyard, in the garden she had planted. near the tree he had once built a swing on for a niece who never visited, and held each other like a quiet promise. Weeks later, at a bookshop in town, a stranger recognized Eleanor. "You're the woman who runs the grief writing group." "Right," Eleanor nodded. "That's me. Your sessions helped my sister. She said you taught her how to speak again." Eleanor smiled gently. "I'm still learning that myself. In time, people would ask them how they made it work, how they went from silence to something steady, and they would both say the same thing. We didn't fix everything. We just stopped pretending we were fine, and we kept showing up. Because real love, the kind that survives the forgetting, isn't about avoiding hurt. It's about choosing to heal together, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Not every love story ends with fireworks. Some end with silence. But the rare ones, the brave ones, begin again. Not because it's easy, but because two people choose to stay when it's hard. Eleanor and Richard's story isn't just about marriage. It's about what we inherit, and whether we choose to pass it on or lay it down. It's about how men are taught to be stoic, and women are told to be patient until both become prisoners of quiet suffering. It's about emotional neglect, not always seen, but deeply felt. And it's about the radical act of showing up not perfectly, but honestly. In a world where love is often glamorized and pain is often hidden, we need stories like this. Stories that remind us to speak, to listen, and to unlearn the silence we've been taught to call strength. If this story touched you, if it made you think of someone you love, or someone you lost, please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we tell truths wrapped in tenderness. And trust us, the next one might just be yours.